Hey, welcome back to Bridal Sewing Techniques, and today we're going to talk about how to line a sheer bodice. It's easier than you think. Are you someone who has experience with a mix of sewing but is looking to get into the bridal sewing niche? This channel is for you. Hit subscribe to become a part of the community.
Excuse me, this is Brenda's computer. We interrupt this amazing video just to, well, basically we're gonna delete days of your life right now. Hours and hours of your life. It's just gonna be gone. Thank you.
I think that's everything.
Well, that's correct on screen. You total down to your first window.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.
As my BST besties know from my announcement on the community tab, this is the second time I've made this video. Basically, in this video, I am going to line 3 different style gowns. So you can see all the different ways to do the process. So yes, it's taken me a lot of work to get this together. And for some reason, it completely disappeared when I was done with it. So this is part 2 or take 2 of it. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below. You know I will be there and I'll answer them the best I can. Thanks. For this Stella York, basically we're going to use the remnant from the hemming process to line this bodice. This fabric is called Pongee, Pongee. And it's that kind of that matte finish. It's your solid layer, usually your first solid layer under the tulle, or sometimes the lining. It's super popular right now. But we're going to use that as long as the grain of it runs right for the lining and you can kind of have it on grain to work with. You can use those hem remnants. They're great. Otherwise, you can just have several different shades of pongee on hand, and you can buy them online. And I do not necessarily have a favorite source on that yet. I'll share that with you when I do find a favorite source. But basically, as you can see, I'm just kind of running a basting stitch along the edge, the neckline so far, the edge of this pattern piece. If you look at the bodice, kind of like several different pattern pieces, like how you could take it apart like an explosion chart kind of idea. Basically what you're going to do is each of those pieces of what would be your pattern, you're going to lay your fabric on it, baste it down, and yes, those stitches were a little bit closer together than a normal basting stitch, but there's a lot of curve going on with this dress. So this particular dress, it has to be pretty accurate. So I'm stitching pretty tightly together here, and that's fine. Whatever your schedule allows for, go for it. But I'm going around this top part now, and I'm going to go down the princess seam, and then also there at the waist. And I'm going to speed this up for you a little bit so you can see. Nothing fancy going on here. Please help me get to the bottom of this basting segment here by hitting the subscribe button. Thank you so much. That saved me so much time. All right, so now we are here at the bottom and we're going to cut away all the excess. We're going to leave about 1/4 of an inch overhanging. That's going to be your seam allowance for what will become the lining on this gown. So we're going to cut that nice and neat. Here we go. Oh, excuse me. I'm getting out of your way as fast as I can. So we're just going to cut. I probably could be doing this with applique scissors that have that wider paddle on the bottom. That's probably safer to do if you're afraid of accidentally cutting the bodice. But I just used a small pair of scissors here. All right, and then here goes another piece that is obviously the right size for the second piece that we need to baste around and cut out. And it's the same process. I'm not going to bore you and take you through all the details of this process, but you have to basically, it's almost like a coloring book. You know, you need to trace around. I am putting a pin in place here and just in the apex of the bust so that it doesn't shift around too much. Obviously, you've got to get all the angles right or it's going to pull funny. And that's what I really want to focus on with this video. Obviously, I could sum up this process in just a sentence or two, right, of how to line a gown. And then you would miss out on all the details that basically keep you from having a lining that's rumpling or pulling funny or changing the way the dress lays or something like that. So I'm going to be talking about those things in particular. So number one is, as you can tell, just based as detailed as you need to so that nothing is pulling funny when you are making your pattern piece. Also, when you cut out this pattern piece, make sure you just kind of lay it freely back over the original gown bodice and make sure it is the right shape and that it's not pulling funny because of the grain of the fabric or anything like that. That is super important. Now I want you to see the shadow behind where I'm working, where you can see the two layers of fabric. I'm letting them overlap by that 1/4 of an inch so that I can get plenty of seam allowance there because they're going to be sewn together and both have their seam allowance. And you just want a little bit of wiggle room in there. Like I said, you don't want your lining to draw up the way the dress drapes or flows or fits. Just a very important piece of advice I heard many years ago, and it has helped me so much. The mark of a garment that is, very professional looking, a lot of times it's that the stitching is not too tight. A lot of times when you're first learning to sew, you're stitching way tighter than you need to. For instance, the buttons are really anchored down to a sport coat or something, and the other side of the coat isn't allowed to kind of freely float around those buttons. And it's kind of the same thing with sewing. You're going to want to have a very light stitch, and we're going to get into that here in a little bit. I'll show you specifically how loose your stitching needs to be so that it can drape well and be secure well in all the correct places. After removing your new pattern pieces, you're going to tidy up the edges and lay them out on your fabric and cut them out and then sew them together just like you are making a garment from scratch. So you can use the one, I like to use the real fabric I'm going to use to make the pattern, right? So you can use that and then plus the new one that you cut out, make sure they're identical. And looky there, a little fairy came along and pressed those seam allowances under for us. Don't forget to put your little relief cuts along the edge so that they curve nicely. All right, so you're going to pin it in place and then you're going to hand stitch it down. It's going to almost be like a basting stitch. Any place like you see at the waistband where there's going to be a little bit of a pulling that causes just a little bit of a stretch, go ahead and ease in a little bit of the extra lining in there. Make sure you stabilize the apex of the bust right there along with the apex of the bust of the gown. Now here is a little peek into the side of another dress so you can see just how loosely tacked this piece is. It's just barely tacked on, and that's just fine. That's going to allow it to float and move as it needs to. A floating dress is not going to cause nearly as many rumples as the lining layer that's really anchored down and isn't in a flexible position. You also usually don't want to sew it down to the very edge of the garment where it can be seen. Go ahead and bump it in a little ways from the edge, and that's going to give you a nice finished look also. You're going to have the original edge on there. The dress that I just gave you as an example has a split down the front of the bodice. So the next type of bodice that I want to talk about lining is one that has a more complete front to it. It doesn't have the split down the middle, and so it only needs one pattern piece. You do not have to try to lay that lining fabric out across the whole bodice and cut it out in one piece or three pieces and get it correct. So basically you're going to kind of take the idea of what we did for the split bodice and only cut out a pattern for half of the front of the bodice. So as you can see, I did all the same things that I did for the other. Kind of followed the outlines with an extra seam allowance, and then I'm going to be able to flip this and it work, but we don't want to seam down the front, so we're going to lay our newly made pattern pieces out where it's on the fold. And okay, so I'll remove that, and then we're going to open up this fabric when we cut it out. See how I did that? That way you don't have a seam down the center front where there may not be a seam on the gown. So again, I'm going to press in the edges, 1/4 inch seam allowance, and add the little relief snips. On to our third example. Now with this one, this gown has sleeves, and the bride wants to add a semi-sheer mesh lining to the back. So it's not a solid lining in the front alone. It's also going to have a semi-sheer mesh back. And I'm also tossing in, if you see to the right of this image, I'm going to talk about a way to, when it's not appropriate for a regular bust pad, to create this petal that works beautifully. For this lining, we're going to start with all the same steps as the others. This lining does go all the way up to the shoulder, and it goes to the side seam. And again, like I said, it's going to go into mesh. So we're first going to make our lining piece. Then we're going to pin down the mesh across the back, and we're just going to kind of swoop the mesh up from somewhere there near the top of the zipper up to, an inch or so away from the side seam in the back. Now we're only going to sew this down to the bottom of the arm's eye where the sleeve meets the side seam of the bodice, okay? So we've got that sewn down as a top stitch, and then we're going to kind of lay the mesh up under the solid lining layer. And as we go through and stitch that, we're going to stitch those two pieces together to the bodice of the dress. Again, nice, loose, light stitches. And then we're going to do a nice little hidden stitch along the waistline of the dress and the mesh lining in the back. Also the front, all that's going to be a hidden stitch along that waistline. Now along the arm's eye here, that's the fancy word for armhole, we're just going to do a top stitch again for that lining layer. We did a hidden stitch up at the top of the shoulder, the hidden stitch down the sides, and like I said, across the front. Now here's another example of a way you can stitch it in very loosely. We're going back to the first dress here. You can see the little tack marks where I just kind of grabbed the edge, and this lining is just floating inside of this dress. So it's got the ability to kind of wiggle a little bit as need be, having the apex there anchored down. And then you sew the bust pad in last on top of that lining. Sometimes that bust pad is a little heavy-handed. Just cut you out two of these teardrop shaped lining fabric pieces, put a little dart in the bottom and sew those in. That nice little lightweight petal is beautiful. It's exactly what some of these petite girls need in these sheer gowns. I hope this video has helped you. Please don't forget, hit like, hit subscribe, hit that bell. Please leave a comment, even if it is just to say, hi, thanks. I hope you're having a beautiful day. I'd love to hear from you down there. Also find me on Instagram at Bridal Sewing. And here is my outro. I know what you're looking for. You've been sewing for years, but you want to get into full-time bridal sewing. But there's something missing. You're missing the backroom secrets, the industry tips and tricks. The tools, the sources, the techniques that give you the speed, and the accuracy that the industry demands. You have found it.